Turning points change the course of our lives, whether it's a big decision, overcoming an obstacle or tragedy, or taking a leap of faith. These stories of inspiration and resilience are what Turning Point is all about. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Turning Point. I'm your host, Priya, and this week I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Andrew Boozary. Dr. Boozary is the Executive Director of Population Health and Social Medicine at the University Health Network. He's also an assistant professor in the Department of Health Policy, Management, and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. Today, we'll hear about one of Dr. Boozary's biggest turning points. It involves the pandemic, his work to advocate for people living with homelessness, and his advocacy for vaccine equity for racialized communities. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Boozary.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
You know, a lot of Canadians have come to know you, myself included, through your advocacy work, through social media, through your media interviews. You, of course, have been working in healthcare through this pandemic, and I think we all know at this point that's come with a lot of challenges. So how are you doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I don't want to, turn this podcast into a couch to lie back to unpack so much of the last 18 months. But, I think, it's been hard for everyone, and I think, again, what we've talked about through the pandemic is just how differential the impact has been, for certain communities and neighborhoods and populations. But, given what we've been through, where we're at, I think everyone, is tired. I think it's been a long stretch. I think everyone wants this to be over. I know that me and my colleagues do. But, I also think it's one of these things where, just even being able to have this conversation is really helpful because there hasn't been a lot of time to reflect in terms of, what we've been through and unpack some of the hurt and try to hopefully get towards, healing as we can. And I think still trying to cling on to whatever optimism. But, definitely I think within the healthcare system, the community sector, there's been so many heroes throughout this. But people are tired. And I think we're really hoping that we can just, climb whatever this last mile is.
Yeah, I think that you really summed it up perfectly there. I mean, it has been exhausting, frustrating, in a lot of moments too. And I like that optimism there that we're, in that last mile of it here. I certainly hope you're right. And I also hope that people like you who've been working so hard on the front lines of this, will get some kind of, break after too, because you certainly deserve it.
Well, appreciate it. I mean, I think for everyone, we all get that break. We all get some rest. But, I also think it's just one of those things where, I hope we actually just learn to do things differently and better. So hopefully that provides some comfort for people, but appreciate the vacation wishes. I will pass that along to the hospital. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. Please pass that on to the hospital. It's very clear that you have a passion for helping vulnerable populations. And I want to go back to your childhood here because your father came to Canada as an Iranian refugee. Your mother also studied human rights law. So I wondered, is there a connection between those pieces of your life and the work that you're doing now?
I think in some way, for sure, again, about not being able to unpack everything and reflect too much as to why, we're doing what we're doing. But for sure, I mean, I owe everything, to my parents, especially, my mother and everything that, she sacrificed and has done for us and our family and the sort of values that have been there, and especially to fight for what we feel for people is right. In terms of, as you mentioned, human rights, but also the civic rights. And I think, that's the part of where I always thought I wanted to actually go do law, because she wasn't able to advance her career here. And, it made a lot of sacrifices for me and my sister to be able, obviously to go to school and provide and help in many ways. But, I think I'm biased, but I think she would have a lot of talent as a lawyer and someone who would be, I'm sure, just a force in that field. And I think, that was always the view. And I think, as ways that she's helped me think about medicine and public health is, how are you going to be an attorney for the marginalized, and to push and, not compromise for the rights of people. And I think we've never seen something like this in a pandemic where it's been so pressed up in terms of, ultimately who has lived and died through the past 18 months has been a matter of public policy and public policy choices. So, I feel always indebted to her, but especially with, what's been going on and just, everything that she's been able to provide in terms of the supports and belief that, this can be lonely, this can be tough. You can put your stuff on the line, but that there's really a power in being aligned with where people are at and trying to make things, just a little bit better.
Well, I think that passion that she obviously kind of instilled in you has certainly shines through in the work that you're doing. And, you're very vocal on social media about some of the injustices that have been experienced by our vulnerable populations during the pandemic. How was it hard for you at all as you started putting that content out? I mean, did you ever worry about what your employer might say or what your colleagues might say?
I think of it, as you look at the pandemic for all of us, I think that there is, talk about turning points. I hope that there's been a turning point for everyone throughout the last 18 months, whether that's been about racial injustice, what's happened to our elders and seniors in long-term care homes, whether it's been about the living and working conditions for essential workers, or the differential access in a vaccine to save lives throughout a pandemic. So I think that there's been many opportunities for, awakening. And again, I think that's where the hope is that we do that as a society. But I think for, me personally, I think we talk a lot about allyship and being an advocate. I think, I hope that people find that their moment of truth about what they're willing to want to sacrifice. I think if you keep thinking about what you can lose and be thinking about how you can try to support for people's gain. And I think that's a really important distinction, though, is I think when we talk about performances or performative allies and things is that, you can do a whole lot of hashtag stuff, which can be important. And I think people who are trying to support different movements, that's something where, again, we're seeing more awareness and activism on social media. But I think for me, I felt it most acutely during the pandemic when you have to make a decision to say, there may be consequences in wanting to be an ally, in wanting to be an advocate, and in wanting to stand up for what was just such a disconnect in life and death that my view was if you don't do this now, when there may not be much left to save, or to try to fight for, and I think how could you then personally say, whatever, privileges or platform you have, not speak out. So that was more of the, I think, calculus I was wrestling with more than, are my colleagues, could I give me the cold shoulder or people be upset or, but I think you have to be willing to say you will have consequences. You may lose your job. It might have been impossible. You might, have other professional consequences. But in the time of the pandemic, when, you're seeing what we were seeing, I never looked back like it was much of a decision. I just knew, I felt like that's just what had to be done.
It's really clear from our conversation so far that, of course, you're so passionate about the work that you do. And I thought it was interesting that you actually initially went to university to study economics. Your father is a doctor, but medicine wasn't sort of your initial area of interest. So what changed your mind?
Yeah, I think when you look back at, again, the decisions we make, sometimes they happen. And, again, not having had the opportunity to unpack one's life like that. But, I think probably early on, again, given everyone wanting to go their own way, I never really had that interest early on to do medicine. I think that there was this view, again, around social and economic injustice that I think was very, heavily passed on from my mother, and that I still just have, so much love for the way that, she sees the world and in terms of her sense of justice. And so I think that that's something where, I've never been able to shake that. And I'm really grateful for that. I think when I was, looking at, what I was hoping to do, it was always, again, even around pursuing economics or other aspects, is how to have more progressive policies and views about how, we can, better learn about how you can have a fairer economy, or, be able to provide more growth and opportunities for people that have been shut out. But it was really, I think, in the sense of, being actually able to have conversations with her about really what, I was really hoping to do with my life and how to serve. And I think just the reality is that there are these huge systems at play, and I think that all of us, everyone, wants to go in with the right values and do. I mean, I think people really do go in, whether it's in business school, journalism, economics, science, they want to make a difference. They want to do and help people, and I don't think that's exclusive to people in nursing or medicine. I think people really do want to do that. I think the challenge that we've seen, especially with the pandemic, is that this is not about individuals and our intent. They're really, powerful systems at play. I think when you look at just how powerful, when you look at the economy or, finance and Bay Street and everything that's happening, it was, I think, probably really early on felt, you're not going to be able to have some of that autonomy to do things a bit differently. But though there are, of course, I'm sure people you've spoken to, and of course, people I look up to in the country that are real trailblazers and change makers in those fields. I probably just realized I wouldn't be able to do it at that level. And I think just felt more within curiosity of like, what's going to be true? How do you pursue whatever that sense of truth is for you when you're, not even 20, and thinking around, how, what kind of ways can you start to pull together, different forms of knowledge and understanding to advocate as well, and I think that became very clear early on. I didn't feel the sense I was going to go into medicine to say, but to specialize in one area and do that. And I have so much respect for my colleagues who do that, and do that so well. But it was always clear for me that there was this intersection with public health, economics, and social justice that, again, I'm just very indebted to my parents for making sure that was a part of everything that I was thinking about.
Fanshawe College's continuing education programs are one reason the college is a leader in part-time adult education. These programs are designed to upgrade your skills and enhance your career. All of the courses are part-time and most are delivered asynchronously online. Whether you're an entrepreneur looking to gain a new skill, someone getting ready to re-enter the workforce, or a professional looking to learn something completely new, Fanshawe really has something for everyone. Registration for winter courses is now open. So did you have to leave university and then go, what did you have to do when you decided to change your mind? Because that's a pretty big pivot.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't actually take science courses in high school. So it was a really big pivot. So I did have to leave. I retook high school courses in chemistry, I remember, and biology, and had to do those grade 11 and 12 courses, and went back to be able to have the prerequisites to be in a science stream. And then I just went full tilt. I think I ended up, I don't even remember what I graduated with, but I think it was double honors pharmacology and toxicology. It was just I don't know what happened, but it's if you're going to go in, just go for it. And I think that's what ended up happening. And of course, once you throw yourself into something and you start finding what your own passions are within it. But I think, all my friends at the time were this is wild. You're going to step away from doing something and a lot of those friends, have done really well in business and economics, and they, continue to remind me of that. But I think, I'm really at peace with the journey, and I'm happy that, early on you sort of take those risks, because I think it was sort of like, is this a huge step backwards? But, I think that's something as well. I think when people are feeling that and they sort of have this innate sense of what you want to do, your own friends can kind of tell you've lost, all bearings about what's going to make sense. But again, fortunate to have my family and friends who actually really believe that, like, hey, this does make sense for you, as wild as it sounds right now. And as you're going to step away for a year, this could work out for you. So again, I'm really grateful for those people who believed in the path.
I often think I'm part of a mentorship program, so I talk to a lot of high school girls, and I always think that, even from my own experience, like having to make that decision about what you're going to do for the rest of your life when you are like 17 or 18 years old, I mean, it's tough. And so many of us obviously change our minds along the way. I think what's really different about your story, though, is that you went back to take those high school courses, and because I think it obviously that's a deterrent sometimes in leaving the friends that you've started university with. So I think that it's a pretty cool part of your story.
But I do think I don't think and I appreciate that, but the mind's all that unique in some ways, because I also think that what I hope is that, what you're doing and others in terms of providing that mentorship is actually what's so important. I think that stage, it wasn't really as readily available, just to date, how old I am. But I do think that it was, being an undergrad was a while ago. And, I think these mentorship programs, these elements of where people are really pushing for different representation in different professions, is so powerful for people, especially young people, to see that, hey, I can do this, I can do that, or do things differently, and there are paths where it can work. And again, I had a lot of, privilege in the fact that, I could talk to my family or get some advice, but, I think that, again, they were sort of removed from what the education system was like here, in terms of the ins and outs. But I think when you look at, what's able to be done with what we have now, and just the progress, especially for racialized communities in different professions that have been so long underrepresented, and to be able from high school, have these outreach programs where people can, young kids can see what that's like. I think that's the stuff that's so exciting and interesting, and I think that everyone, and again, I think we also just kind of punish people for like a decision you make when you're 17 if that's not what you want to do. And the system's so hard to change or pivot. Like, you've got these prerequisites and all these other things that, again, are just these barriers on people. And if you don't know how to navigate them, or you don't have family or, connections that can kind of help we walk through what that's like, which many of us didn't actually have, you're kind of out there on your own to make those decisions. And so I think, it's just really important about the work that you're doing and others, to make sure that people can see that not every door closes behind you, and not every door has been open for people. So I think as we can open more doors and let people have more freedom to discover what it is they really want to be doing, I think that would be just so important for the education system, and not trap people in decisions they made when, who knows what music we were listening to at like 17 or 18. And you're like, that's the decision I'm going to make when I was listening to that on like your iPod or Walkman, or it's terrible again, how long ago that was.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I do, it's interesting that we're having this conversation, because I do make a point of telling anyone I'm mentoring, it is always okay to change your mind, and you shouldn't feel bad about that. Because I think, so many of us go through career changes or change our minds partway through school, and there can be a lot of guilt around that. And, that, especially if you maybe grew up in a family where there's that mentality of, you pick something and you stick with it and you see it through. And not that there isn't value in that too, but sometimes when you feel yourself being pulled in another direction, I think it's really important to acknowledge that and explore that, fully before making that final decision.
Totally. I mean, yeah, I can't agree more. And I think it's the shame piece too. And again, I think that, or just the questioning. And so again, I think for anyone who's making those decisions, the fact that there are networks now to help people, I think that's great. And hopefully, more people can take those sort of risks.
Yeah. And speaking of, you mentioned barriers earlier. Your father was trained as a physician in Iran, and then he came to Canada. And I know that he obviously wasn't able to practice medicine here right away. So he also had to go back to school and get basically retrained, right, in order to practice here?
He did. Yeah. I mean, again, I think, so much of what you do, and sometimes you don't think about it because we're all trying to carve out our own path. And especially when you're a teenager or growing up, you're like, this is about me and I'm going to find my own, identity and journey. And, it might be different than, my father, my mother's, and I'm going to set out. And I think that's very true and important as we grow up. But as you do get a bit older and you look back, I think, my dad's just one of the toughest guys I know. You think about what, people been through. And again, I think, we don't get to talk about it too much, but, for, the Iranian community, I think just the amount of hardships that have gone on and what, people have been doing and the resilience that the Iranian community has. I think it's just like many communities, of course, that come as immigrants or refugees to this country, and what they've been able to do and help in this country is just phenomenal. But I think about just the resilience that people have. When you talk about leaving school. Or for me, I had to, I left medical school to go to graduate school and came back to med school. And people are like, oh, that's tough. And I think, but well, you took some time away from medical school for a few years to do this and you came back. I mean, my dad's generation of people, they were in medical school, but they had to go to jail as political prisoners and then come back. You think about, that era, and again, of our parents, so many, I think when you think about is for us as, children of immigrants or refugees, what they laid on the line. So I think that always, humbles you real quick. You start to think, well, I'm doing some really tough stuff. And you're thinking, well, it's cool, but, in relevance to what, our family members have had to go through, for us to have these opportunities, I think it's always then again about thinking about how, so many people are hardworking. So many people come here to do all they can, and to provide not only for their family, but for other people. And I think for me, I've always sort of felt like, there's an element of luck for sure. And you can't start, to believe in your own, whatever sort of hype you want to have, or think you have. You don't. I think that for us, it's that, some bounces went the right way for, our family. And there's so many people where my dad and mom first set up in St. Jamestown of Toronto, that worked hard, do everything, have had everything else, and more, that may not have gotten the same breaks. And I think that always grounds me in what we're doing. That's why I think you can never separate from, people's journey and their own pain and think that, you've got something that's all that different. I mean, all of our parents came to hustle and provide and do what they could. So I think, definitely hard for my father, for my mother in terms of trying to figure out his place, like so many people. But there was that opportunity again of where there's a lot of, fortune, to have that happen, and good fortune, and luck. And that changes it. But I think when you grow up in it first, you never really shake the fact that again, how then all of a sudden you go in these different neighborhoods or sort of opportunities and sort of think oh, these people are different. People who are in poverty, aren't working as hard. Or these people in poverty, if they just did this or this differently. That's not what it's about. It's the fact that we've forced this vulnerability, as we call it, or these risks on people, and then want to celebrate the few that kind of get out and say, well, they did something so different. If only, our neighbors down the hall in the apartment building did the same thing. No, I mean, I think you live that and you see that early on, even as a kid, that that's just not true. And I mean, I think you see it too as a child when, I remember, in St. Jamestown, which is, 1 block away from Rosedale. And you can kind of see like how leaf, as a kid, you think that's like Narnia or something, and you can tell because it's like all these buildings here and there's like no green space. And there's like so much green space just, when you look across Burn Building. And I think the other element, is we saw this play out with the pandemic, not to take it back, but, there was a block difference in COVID positivity rates that were multiple fold different and people getting access to vaccines so differently. So, I think all of this comes back to, again, what opportunities are really there. And especially, I think you see it so wide-eyed as a kid because you don't understand all the jargon and stuff that we get taught as to like why we have these differences and what you're supposed to believe. But when you're a child, it just makes so much sense to you that, the air is different on that side and the opportunities are different. And it's not that people here are working any less hard or have any less talent. And so I think that's the piece where, that's always stuck with me for sure.
Yeah, I feel like that just gave us a lot of insight into a kind of how what you're doing right now is sort of started building through your experiences when you were younger. And you're right. As you talk about the hardship your parents experienced, it's such important perspective when we kind of reflect on our own lives and on what we experience here, because, my mother also came here as an immigrant. And yeah, when I think about the challenges in my own life, I often, when I'm having a bad day or when I get really wrapped up in something, that's happening at work, I try to remind myself, like, you're in your own little world right now, and things can be so much different and so much harder. So yeah, that I appreciate that perspective. I know you mentioned you kind of brought us back to the pandemic there, and I did want to kind of just revisit your turning point here because it's been a year and a half now. Geez, I think we're all losing track of time. Yeah. But since this kind of big turning point with the pandemic started, when your work and your advocacy really started to come to the forefront, as you kind of reflect back, is there anything that you're most proud of that you have contributed to help change during this pandemic?
Yeah, I don't usually like the word pride, but I think if that's the question, and again, I'm sorry if it went off, different topics. You had like a flow of questions, and I'm glad we've just been able to have the conversation. But yeah, I never really think of things in the sense of pride, but I really do think that, it's important to reflect about what you feel, honored in ways to be a part of and to contribute to in whatever small way, and I think that's really important. And again, I appreciate actually this conversation because you're starting to connect the dots for me that I probably haven't in my own life. So I think, as we joked about sitting on a couch, this has probably happened, even though I didn't want it to happen. I think, when we look at, I'd really just say it's the partnerships and the relationships with people over the last 18 months that have really came into a completely different focus. Like, I remember early on, like if it's just driving out hand sanitizer and some personal protective equipment to people in the middle of the night when this first started, that's when you like develop relationships with people who are doing such good work in different spots. And that's, or what they've done, people have done for me. I still think like we could talk, and I have, so much about how unfair and unequal the pandemic has been. But there's so many people who have stepped up, and I'm just grateful to have been, part of some of this work of people who have stepped up and to become really deep friends. As you were mentioning about saying, we don't know how much time has passed, in the pandemic, everything becomes really blurry. And that's really true because, I look at, some people I've worked with, you kind of knew some of them before, but now I feel like, you're best of friends. It's like been like 10 years you've been this. Like, I think like pandemic years, like a pressure cooker, like you now know people for a decade and you're like, if people don't get wedding invites, and that's going to be terrible. I feel like that's a sense of how close you're getting with people. And I think that's the part where I feel like, that was something to look back at, and to be able to learn from people who've been doing so much and get to know them so personally and just build elements of trust, I think, to me, is something that I don't think we put enough of importance on that in our system before the pandemic. And I think it's about, being able to take the call at whatever time when people are in need of help, and doing what you say you're going to do, and doing it in a way where you're doing it in partnership and not just saying, I want to go play savior hero, so I'm going to go and try to do something. No, that's never going to be good. That's never going to be sustainable. And that's not really what that work is about. So I think if it's ways of where, I think that learning and growth for me and for many, I hope, is probably the part that I feel best about. And I think, again, as you said, I think the challenge for all of us is like, how do we keep that going in our lives? Like, to your point, I think, you could say a lot of things, do a lot of interviews and try, or, put out a lot of posts, or, whatever sort of ways to try to influence the discussion on whichever medium. But how does this now become meaningful in the way that, we act and behave and operate in our own spaces now, in our own, sectors and industries? And that's what I'm hopeful for. And that would give me pride, actually. I think if the system was changing more for the system and for all the people doing the good work than for me individually.
I think that's a perfect note to leave this on. You have given us so much to think about. And I hope that on your last point there, maybe a couple of years from now, we'll be doing another interview about another turning point and talking about some of those changes that have come from the work that's been done during this pandemic. So thank you so much, Dr. Boozary, for this conversation, and for sharing about your work and also about your life. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks so much for reaching out and all the profound insights you've given me. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening today. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a comment. Please subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. We love hearing from you. If you have a Turning Point story, you can also email us at turningpoint@priyasam.com. Until next time, take good care of yourselves and of each other.